Disclaimer. According to the ancient runes, J.K. Rowling owns Harry Potter. Credit to Troy Guffey for having Hermione document runestones with a camera. The next day was Hogsmeade Day, the traditional celebrate the end of exams visit day, and given the mixed emotions of elation at Umbridge's departure combined with grief for the death of a fellow student, Dumbledore decided it was better not to cancel it, and instead let the students vent their energy in the village. There were naturally safety concerns, but they would be dealt with by a heavy Auror presence, and Harry and Hermione in particular were asked not to leave the grounds without an Auror escort. After the mess he'd been through, Harry elected not to go, and instead spent the day relaxing in the castle with Ginny. Hermione, however, had a job she needed to do in Hogsmeade that could not wait. She was definitely feeling better today, and her injuries were healing nicely, so she was ready to go. She grabbed Colin Creevey and his camera, and after some cajoling of the Auror guards, she successfully got Tonks to be her escort in the village. Someone with a healthy skepticism of the rules was called for here. Tonks was naturally apologetic when she first met up with them. "Hermione, I'm so sorry about the Department of Mysteries," she said. "I should have been with the Order, but I had to help McGonagall, and then I had to book Umbridge, and then when Vector told me you'd been kidnapped, I thought it was more important to get a strong Auror team together, but all we did was get there when it was all over." "It's okay, Tonks," she assured her. "You did what you thought was best, and you still helped drive Voldemort away." Right. Thanks, Hermione. So, where are you going that you need a photographer?" "I need to find a runestone. Professor Slughorn said they would be in a line extending due east from the castle." "A runestone?" she said in surprise. "Do I even want to know?" "Probably not," Hermione said with a grin. Tonks didn't know where any runestones would be, besides the one under the Hogsmeade Town Hall, but Hermione reasoned that if they were based on the old milestone system, even though the Romans had never come this far north, they should be 1 mile apart. That did not go as well as she'd hoped. It turned out the old Scots mile was about 200 yards longer than the English statute mile she was naively assuming, but using a map and compass, she eventually found one as Tonks indulgently stalked into the woods near the Shrieking Shack to search with them. The runestone was smaller than the Roman milestones she'd looked up in the library. A rectangular block of granite about 3 feet high and maybe half that on a side, carved all over with tidy little runes. She asked Colin to take photos of all 4 sides. Unlike the masterpieces that was the Hogwarts anchor stones, this stone seemed to be maintaining only a few basic area spells. She'd have to look them up, but she could guess the main ones were the Trace, the Portkey Network, the Floo Network, something to reinforce unplottability charms, the local muggle-repelling charms for Hogsmeade, and runes to prevent wear on the stone itself. Luckily, many of the relevant rune clusters were fairly easy to pick out in such a small area, unlike the big anchor stones, and she anticipated little difficulty in interpreting it. Tonks did grow a little nervous when Colin started taking pictures. She wasn't stupid, and she could guess what they were for. "Hermione," she said, "are you trying to do what I think you're trying to do?" "I will not confirm or deny," she said, "but I promise you, Tonks, it's for a good cause." Tonks hesitantly accepted that. "Okay, just don't do anything stupid, then." Colin was loving it either way. He thought it was amazing how the Ministry extended a magical web like that over the entire country, rather than disturbing, as Hermione found it. She told him to meet her by the kitchens the next morning, and she'd show him something really amazing. Professor Slughorn arrived at the castle to visit Hermione and Harry that afternoon. Harry begged off Ginny for a little while to talk to him in private, and they met him at the main doors, from which Hermione led the way to the 7th floor. "It's good to see the both of you in one piece," Slughorn said. "I was sorry to hear about your friend. From what I heard, he had the makings of a great Quidditch commentator." "He was a good man, Professor," Hermione snapped. "He was young, and he had his whole life ahead of him, and he gave his life for his friends because nobody else was competent enough to protect us." "Oh, don't get me wrong. He certainly was a good man," Slughorn said apologetically. "Not just anyone could charge in against the Death Eaters like that. I'm sure he will be remembered well." "Sorry, Professor," she mumbled. It's still pretty raw." Of course, Miss Granger, I understand. I'm far too familiar with the feeling myself from all these wars." They made awkward small talk until they reached the room of requirement and Hermione activated it.
"People know about this place now," she explained, "but it's still reasonably private, and honestly the rest of the castle isn't very well furnished for guests."
She opened the door and revealed that it opened onto a small but luxurious lounge with a picture window that offered a beautiful view of the lake. "Ah, I do admire your taste, Miss Granger," Slughorn said. They entered the room and sat down. Hermione had briefly discussed the plan with Harry. They would butter Slughorn up to start with, and they would wait to ask what they needed to know so that he would not be as suspicious. Hopefully, between that and appealing to the seriousness of the war, it would be enough to convince him to open up.
"We wanted to thank you properly for agreeing to teach us this year, Professor," Hermione started. "I know it can't have been easy. Professor Dumbledore said you really wanted to avoid the Order, so we're glad that we could reach a compromise. And I was so grateful last autumn. I don't remember if I told you, but it's so hard to find a tutor as a Muggle-born, and I was honestly worried that if I stayed at Hogwarts, my parents could wind up in Azkaban if something went wrong."
"Yeah, and since you agreed to teach me too, it saved me a lot of trouble," Harry agreed. "I've been very happy to help, Mr. Potter, Miss Granger," Slughorn replied. "It's been a joy to teach two such distinguished students. And besides that, headquarters was much nicer than where I was staying before."
"Well, we just wanted to show our appreciation for you, so we got you this," Hermione said.
She handed him a small wrapped parcel. Slughorn took it, looking pleased, and carefully unwrapped it. When he opened the box, his eyebrows shot up. It was a new gold double Albert watch chain, diamond-studded, serial number Epsilon 5. He held it up to the light. "You bought this for me?" he asked. "I bought the chain," Harry said. "Hermione added the diamonds." He fished out his wand and conjured a jeweler's loupe to inspect the diamonds more carefully. These look flawless, Miss Granger," he said. "How did you manage this?"
"That, Professor, is a trade secret," she said. "Just remember the name, Archimedes."
With luck, that would give him the impression of a revolutionary up-and-comer in the business world that she was going for. She leaned closer to him.
"Will you keep this a secret, Professor? You can use the name in public, but I'd rather no one knew who was behind it."
"Certainly, Miss Granger. Is this business? You're going for the mysterious angle, I assume?"
"Yes, plus it's better that the Death Eaters don't know about it. Of course, I've already invested in Creevy Brothers Pictures, and I'm a partner in Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, but this is one of my own. I have the means to cater to the most elite of the elite, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about it in a few years." She knew he'd like that bit. "Then I'm honored you trust me enough to confide in me," he said, "and to gift me with such a marvelous artifact, with Mr. Potter's help, of course." Hermione smirked inwardly. This was going even better than she'd hoped. "May I ask how you're getting it started?" She nodded and told him the basics, keeping it vague enough that he probably couldn't piece everything together. It was risky, but if Dumbledore was right about his secrets, she was sure his discretion could be trusted. He certainly seemed pleased with what she told him. Gradually, the conversation turned to other topics, such as how their friends were doing, and eventually asking what had happened in the Department of Mysteries. Hermione and Harry again gave him a relatively vague description. After Dumbledore's reaction, she decided to skim over the dark magic she used. It was this topic that gave her a segue to bring the conversation around to their true interest. "Professor, there's something we really need to ask you about. We haven't had the time, and we didn't expect it to run right up against the end of term." Slughorn leaned forward with a quizzical look. "What do you need to know?" he asked. "We know you taught Voldemort when he was a student, sir, and Professor Dumbledore thought you might have some useful insights into his history. Since he's been so busy, he asked us to talk to you about it." He immediately became more guarded at that. "I'm not sure what insights he thinks I could provide," he said. "To be honest, he was a bit vague with us, too, but we know it was something to do with Horcruxes." A glare crossed Slughorn's face. It might have been the first time she'd seen that look on him. "Well, I don't know what Dumbledore's playing at," he huffed, "but I know nothing about Horcruxes,
and I do need to be on my way." He hefted his bulk up to leave.
"Yes, he said you would say that," Hermione said.
He barely slowed down. "Then you can see he's wasting your time." "He's not wasting our time," Harry said. He jumped up and ran in front of him.
"I don't always agree with Dumbledore, but he always has a reason for what he does, Professor," Hermione said, rising calmly to join her friend. "And if you don't know anything about Horcruxes, why are you being so defensive about them?"
"You don't know what you're meddling with." "But Dumbledore does, and he said it's important," Harry said. "This has been a lovely chat, but stand aside, please." Slughorn's hand inched toward his wand as he tried to get to the door. Hermione was faster on the draw.
"Professor, I knocked out 2 Death Eaters single-handedly after being disarmed, bound, and gagged," she said quickly. "Do you really want to try this, or will you sit down and hear us out?"
At that, Slughorn actually paled. It was a gamble, she knew. If it came to a fight, Slughorn had a lifetime of experience on her. But he wasn't a courageous person, and she did know a few tricks no other witch or wizard did. He stood there, seemingly frozen with indecision.
"I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I don't want to fight you, and I know I can't make you tell, but I would like to be able to have a level-headed discussion about this. I have a lot of respect for you, and this is just so out of character for you as an intellectual."
Slughorn looked between his 2 students, and he eventually backed down, slumping into his seat. "I meant what I said. You do not understand what you're meddling with, Miss Granger, Mr. Potter," he repeated. "I don't know why Dumbledore wants you to know about such vile magic, but no good can come of it." So he did know something about it. "Not even defeating Voldemort?" Harry said. He flinched at the name, but he shook his head. "Mr. Potter, I've seen far too much damage done by such forays into dark magic."
"It was by Voldemort, wasn't it?" Hermione asked. "The Horcruxes, they're some kind of weapon or artifact he has?"
Maybe they were what made him so powerful, she thought. Slughorn didn't respond immediately, so she continued.
"Sir, Professor Dumbledore has been giving us assignments of sorts for the Order. There's a lot I can't really tell you, but basically we've come to the conclusion that the only way to beat Voldemort for good is to hit him with something he doesn't see coming. And Harry especially needs to be ready. He's Voldemort's #1 target. And I am trying to invent the magic for him to use. I have ideas for spells that I'm pretty sure Voldemort doesn't know are even possible. Even Dumbledore thinks I have a good chance at it. But if we're going to succeed at this, don't we need to know exactly what we're up against? If Voldemort has some powerful secret weapon, don't we need to know about it?"
Slughorn regarded her with renewed interest. He sounded almost hopeful when he spoke again. "Miss Granger, does Dumbledore truly believe you 2 can fight he who must not be named?"
"Not alone, of course, but working together with the Order? Yes, he does."
Technically, she was stretching the truth a little. She hadn't run her particular spells past Dumbledore, but he had admitted her plan was plausible. "But we're going to need your help, Professor." Harry found the thread, shooting Hermione a grateful look. "Dumbledore needs me to be strong enough to stand up to Voldemort. I need Hermione to teach me how to do that. We both need the Order and our friends to save our arses when we get into trouble. And we need your help too, sir, but we don't need you to fight. We only need a little information. Can you do that for us? Tell us what we need to know in order to survive whatever horrible trouble we seem to get into every year?" Hermione was once again thankful for Harry. He really got it when he paid attention. They were Slughorn's only 2 students right now, and he thought very highly of both of them. Harry's plea would play to his softer spots. Slughorn looked at her sadly and said, "You may not respect me as much if I tell you, Miss Granger."
"Sir, I can already guess that you told Tom Riddle something you shouldn't have," she told him. "I promise I'll respect you more if you have the courage to do the right thing."
Their teacher raised his head a little higher. "You truly are a Gryffindor at heart, Miss Granger," he said. He paused for a minute, thinking it over, and he began to speak. "You have to understand, a Horcrux is the darkest form of magic known to wizardkind. What Riddle did with that knowledge was beyond the pale. I can only hope Dumbledore's right and you can make it right again." He took a deep breath and continued. "A Horcrux is an object in which a person has concealed part of their soul." Hermione needed a couple of seconds for that to sink in, and then she groaned and put her head in her hands. This was going to be the Dementors all over again, wasn't it? "A
Part of their soul? She asked. What does that even mean?
It's just as it sounds. A dark wizard is capable of splitting their soul into pieces. And no, I don't know how it's done, and I wouldn't tell you if I did. Man is not meant to meddle in such things. I can tell you only that it requires an ultimate act of evil. Murder, Harry said. There was an air of certainty in the word, and Slughorn nodded. Yes, a murder committed in cold blood. In the back of her mind, Hermione flagged that thought. It seemed a bit too neat. Neville would probably have a different idea of what an ultimate act of evil was. More likely, it was a ritual that went back to the long tradition of human sacrifice in various cultures. With a Horcrux, he continued, part of the soul is hidden in an object outside the body. Then, even if the body is destroyed, the Dark Wizard cannot die, for part of their soul remains earthbound and undamaged. That's how Voldemort came back, isn't it? Harry whispered in horror. He made a Horcrux so he couldn't die, and he was only left as a spirit. Slughorn lowered his gaze and shook his head. Oh, how I wish it were that simple, Mr. Potter. You know who didn't make one Horcrux? He made 6.
6? Hermione gasped.
He looked up again, his voice hollow and halting. When Tom Riddle was a student, he came to me and he asked me about Horcruxes. He seemed to know something about them already, but I was still so dazzled by his talent I didn't want to suspect him. I filled in some of the gaps for him. I'm ashamed to say it, but I did. But what he suggested was so horrifying I couldn't deny the darkness in him any longer. He thought that one Horcrux wasn't safe enough. He suggested that 6, for a 7-part soul, would guard him more firmly against death and perhaps even make him arithmetically more powerful. I told him not to think such things, I swear to you. I told him that to split one's soul into 7 pieces would be a horror beyond contemplation, but the damage was done. So that means Voldemort can't die unless his Horcruxes are destroyed? Harry asked. He'd gone even paler than Slughorn by now. I'm afraid so, Mr. Potter. Until they are destroyed, he will always be able to return. Hermione was horrified. How could you fight a man who couldn't die? Obviously, Dumbledore was trying to tell them that the Horcruxes would have to be destroyed, and soon. But what were they? Where were they? What if the task was impossible? Could he be contained indefinitely? But she soon realized that if this exercise wasn't to be completely pointless, Slughorn must know something Dumbledore didn't. Or at least Dumbledore expected him to. Professor, do you have any idea what, or where, Voldemort's Horcruxes are? Certainly not. I wasn't about to make that confrontation with him, and he probably would have killed me if I had. I should think Dumbledore has more leads on that front. He hasn't told us much, Harry said. I think he was waiting for this information. Hermione wondered if they had any information to pin down any Horcruxes. Dumbledore had pointed out a young Riddle's habit of collecting trophies, and he had noted a couple of heirlooms of his family. She tried to think if she knew of any other objects associated with Voldemort, and to her surprise, one did come to mind. Professor, these Horcruxes, would they be able to possess people? She asked. Possess? Why, yes they would, Slughorn said in surprise. Why? And they could carry out his plans? They could give someone his ability to speak Parseltongue? Hermione, what are you talking about? Harry asked. The diary, the one that possessed Ginny. I think it was a Horcrux. Think about it. What book has a mind of its own and has a magical ability like Parseltongue? Comprehension dawned on Harry's face. Merlin's beard. But that means we already destroyed a Horcrux, he said. If I'm right, we'll have to ask Dumbledore. We should go talk to him right away. Professor Slughorn, thank you very much. You've been a great help. I hope. And I really did mean what I said. I have a lot of respect for you, and I'm very grateful to you for teaching me this term. He sighed with relief. Thank you, Miss Granger. That's good to hear, and I wish you the best of luck. I fear you'll need it. She nodded, and the two of them left the room and hurried back to Dumbledore's office to tell him what they had learnt. He beamed at them when they told him. This is spectacular news, he said. Very well done. I knew you could do it.
Professor, spectacular isn't exactly the word I'd use, Hermione said. What Professor Slughorn told us about Horcruxes, I'm starting to worry that we can't win this fight.
A shadow seemed to cross Dumbledore's face, but it vanished so quickly that Hermione thought she must have imagined it. "You should not fear for such an imminent defeat, Hermione," he said, "for we are now armed with knowledge that I think will be crucial to defeating Voldemort. Come, tell me what you have learnt." They repeated everything Slughorn had told them. Dumbledore nodded in agreement throughout their explanation, and he looked thoughtful when they were finished. "I have been hoping for this information for a long time," he said. "It confirms the theory I have been working on, and shows us just how far we have to go." Hermione narrowed her eyes at the headmaster. How much of this had he already known? What wasn't he telling them?
"Could you maybe fill in some of the gaps for us, sir?" she asked.
"Of course. Excuse me. I should start at the beginning. I knew on the 1st of November, 1981, that Voldemort was not dead. You see, the dark mark, which he has branded onto the arm of every member of his inner circle, is tied to his life force. If he were truly dead, it would have faded away completely. However, Professor Snape confirmed to me that it had not, so I was forced to conclude that he had survived. How he had survived I could only guess. There was not enough evidence at the scene. Over the years I developed several theories, a Horcrux being one of them. But I could not confirm it until 3 years ago, when I was given conclusive proof that Voldemort had split his soul." He stopped and looked between them, as if expecting them to make the connection. "Tom's diary?" Harry said. "Indeed, a mere memory, or a cursed object, could not both think and act for itself, and drain Miss Weasley's life force in order to grow stronger. The diary was assuredly a Horcrux. But this troubled me for another reason. The Horcrux was destroyed, and Voldemort still yet lived. And I knew he would not be so careless as to turn his only chance at immortality into a weapon. The only explanation was that he had made multiple Horcruxes, something that no dark wizard in recorded history had ever done before. It then became a task to learn Voldemort's full plan for the Horcruxes. That is why it was crucial for you to speak to Professor Slughorn. Shortly before his retirement, he confided to me a hint that the young Tom Riddle had discussed the subject with him as a student, but he refused to say anything more. Thanks to you, we now know what the plan is. 6 Horcruxes for a 7-part soul." "But what are they?" Harry asked. And where are they?"
"That is why I had begun showing you the memories I had collected in April," he replied.
He rose from his seat to retrieve his pensieve from its cabinet. "I had collected many memories of Voldemort over the years, and once I knew what to look for, I combed through them again for any clues to his Horcruxes. I had hoped to spend more time on them, to give you time to ruminate and fully absorb them, and to consider them from many angles to tease out hidden details, as I have. But alas, our time is much shorter than I feared. Our plans for the summer are uncertain, and so we must finish them now. Let us begin." Dumbledore prepared the pensieve, and they viewed 2 more memories. The first showed an 18-year-old Tom Riddle working as an errand boy for Bargain and Burke's, a shop that had a really dark reputation, but from the look of it, it was really just the magical equivalent of a pawn shop. On this particular errand, Riddle went to visit a rich and gaudy old maid named Hepzibah Smith, who confided to him that she was in possession of not 1, but 2 artifacts from the founders of Hogwarts: Slytherin's locket, which Riddle's mother had sold to Mr. Burke years earlier, and a golden cup belonging to her ancestor, Helga Hufflepuff. It was impossible to miss the covetous look in Riddle's eyes. It emerged that Hepzibah Smith died 2 days later. Her house elf, Hooky, who was very old and easily confused, confessed to accidentally poisoning her cocoa, which everyone, but Dumbledore, believed. The 2 founders' artifacts were lost, but this was not deemed suspicious because Hepzibah's heirs all accused each other of stealing them. The final memory was short. It was 10 years later, after Riddle had more or less openly begun going by the name Voldemort, and after he had begun recruiting his Death Eaters, though they were then known as the Knights of Walpurgis. Voldemort was already becoming disfigured by dark magic, and his eyes had a permanent red cast. Yet he still came up to Hogwarts and asked Dumbledore, to his face, to take up the role of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. He was, of course, refused. This was an obvious ruse, the older Dumbledore said, since Voldemort must have known he would never give him the job, and by that point his only interest in the post was as a further recruitment tool. But as to his true motive, Dumbledore knew nothing, although it was at this time that Voldemort cursed the job so that no defense professor could remain longer than 1 year.
So Voldemort's actually been collecting powerful artifacts his whole life?
Hermione said dejectedly. That was worrying enough, aside from the Horcrux aspect.
To a degree, Dumbledore answered. He has no great store like the Department of Mysteries has, but yes, he collected these few, and I believe 1 or 2 others.
Those are the Horcruxes, aren't they? Harry asked.
Very good, Harry. Given Voldemort's proclivity for collecting valuable trophies, I believe he made them into Horcruxes.
That seemed a bit odd to Hermione.
So he hasn't been using them? She asked. For their purported powers? No, he has not. Voldemort regards spells and rituals, more direct attacks, as a far surer means to power. And these artifacts are all so old that any accurate records of their powers, if they even had any, are lost. Rather, I believe he thought that having famous and valuable artifacts as Horcruxes would render his soul more secure. Well, that sounds well and good, Professor, but what if you're wrong?
What do you mean? Dumbledore asked.
I mean, what if Voldemort's just a kleptomaniac, and the artifacts aren't related to the Horcruxes?
Harry also gave her a funny look at that.
Think about it, she said. If Voldemort's any kind of smart, he'll have used an unassuming rock for a Horcrux and tossed it in the ocean. What if it's literally impossible to find them all?
Harry looked horrified, and Dumbledore turned solemn.
Ah, yes, the headmaster said. I admit the thought has kept me awake for more than a few nights. In that case, we would have to find some way to bind him permanently. No easy task, but it would be the only option available to us. But on the whole, I think Voldemort has 2 great weaknesses that make such a scenario very unlikely. First, he is vain and narcissistic. He regards himself in all respects as exceptional. He would not accept such a mundane object as a rock to house a piece of his own precious soul. This, I believe, is why he collected priceless historical artifacts to serve his purpose. And second, and I am even more certain of this, Voldemort desires control in all things. He would never place a Horcrux beyond his ability to personally access it, just in case he ever needed to.
Hermione thought that over. It made sense, and it seemed consistent with Voldemort's character, but she didn't want to take the chance of underestimating him.
I admit that sounds plausible, sir, she said. But just the same, what if we've made a mistake? Or if a future Dark Lord ever gets smart and hides his Horcrux at the bottom of the ocean, or launches it into space or something?
Then we will be in for a very difficult time, Dumbledore said. But let us worry about one problem at a time. We have a plan that has a strong chance of success, far greater than any other, and we should pursue it. That's still only 4 Horcruxes, though, Harry said. What about the other 2?
That is the first puzzle we must solve, Harry, but again, we have clues. Consider the objects that Voldemort seems to have used for his Horcruxes. The diary, with its connection to the Chamber of Secrets, marking him personally as something extraordinary. An heirloom from his once wealthy and powerful wizard family. An heirloom from Salazar Slytherin, and an heirloom from Helga Hufflepuff.
Artifacts from the Founders, maybe? Harry suggested.
Yes, I think so. Voldemort feels a powerful draw for such symbolism, and 4 objects from the 4 founders of Hogwarts, the greatest wizards known to him in his youth, would have captivated his imagination, and would have equaled a 6. Now I am confident that the only known relics of Gryffindor remain uncorrupted, for they are both in this office. Harry turned around and looked at the sword of Gryffindor in its glass display case. That's one, he said. What's the other? The Sorting Hat, of course, and I think we would notice if it had turned evil. Excuse me, but can you be absolutely certain of that, Professor?
Hermione challenged him again.
"Do you have a spell to detect Horcruxes?"
"Not as such, but the corrupting influence of a Horcrux is impossible to hide. This is another advantage we have. All magic, and especially dark magic, leaves traces. I have to guess that Voldemort instead tracked down an artifact of Ravenclaw's, or perhaps an undiscovered artifact of Gryffindor's, and made it into Horcrux number 5. "Why not both?" Harry asked, confused. "Because, Harry, I know what the 6th Horcrux is." "You do?" "Yes. You will recall the behavior of Voldemort's snake Nagini when she bit Arthur Weasley before Christmas. I don't wish to bring up bad memories, but you will particularly remember how you witnessed the scene in your dream through the eyes of the snake. That would be possible only if Voldemort was able to project his consciousness into the snake, and since he has a corporeal body himself, this can only mean that the snake is a Horcrux." "You can use animals as Horcruxes?" he asked. "It is not advisable, of course, for the animal would still have a mind of its own, and would be more vulnerable. But we can reasonably reconstruct what happened from these clues. Voldemort had evidently not made his 6th Horcrux as of Halloween 1981. This is another piece of evidence, Hermione, that he was seeking special and powerful artifacts to use as his Horcruxes, rather than mundane items that he could have found any time. I believe he meant to do so that night, with your death, Harry. He would certainly have appreciated the symbolism of destroying his prophesied greatest enemy, and cementing the final piece of his plan for immortality in the same act. But as we know, he failed. Some years later he acquired a body again, and, fearful that his defeat might be repeated, he made a Horcrux using the first particularly notable object he had at hand, his familiar, choosing again to make his final Horcrux into a weapon." Hermione had to admit that made a lot more sense than the first part of Dumbledore's theory. She still worried about a future Dark Lord being smarter about that, though. She had a feeling she'd want to look into doing something about that eventually. She'd have to add it to her list. Her list was beginning to look alarmingly long. "So the diary's gone," Harry said. "The ring, the locket, the cup, and the snake are still out there, and the last one is something of Ravenclaw's or maybe Gryffindor's." "An accurate and succinct summary, Harry." "So how do we find them?" "That I am still working on. As I have been researching Voldemort's life for more information about the Horcruxes, I have also been searching for places he may have hidden them, places that might have held a particular significance to him. As I said, he would want them to be accessible just in case. But I confess I have made little progress so far. I will of course inform you when I know more and give you the opportunity to join me in searching them out." "You will?" he said in surprise. "Oh, yes, I think you have earned that right. And after all, Harry, you are, if you'll excuse the expression, the chosen one. And you, Hermione, have proved yourself more than capable, although I caution you that Harry's connection to Voldemort will make him more suited to that task." Hermione thought she heard a hint of, "and I want to keep tabs on you," in there, but she didn't begrudge him for it. Much.
"Thank you, Professor."
"You're quite welcome. Now, naturally, this information will have to be kept private," he continued, "but I think you can safely tell your friends, the Weasley children, given your closeness with them."
"Even though they don't know occlumency?"
she asked. "It was only Harry's mind that I ever truly worried about, although for you to learn it as well was a nice bonus. You may tell them, and about the prophecy too." Dumbledore didn't say it, but it was clearly implied that he was not intending for them to tell Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. While they were well-meaning and cared a lot for them, their natural protectiveness, especially Mrs. Weasley's, would only get in the way. They left Dumbledore's office in silence. Hermione wasn't quite sure what to think. The fact that it was even possible to split a soul into pieces was unsettling. The fact that Voldemort was literally invincible in his current state was terrifying. And she couldn't seem to shake a bit of confusion about some of the things Dumbledore had said, mainly about the snake. It felt like it didn't quite add up, but she couldn't place why. But still, even though Voldemort had them massively outclassed, at least they had a plan. That was something. Professor McGonagall returned to the castle the next morning. Hermione and a lot of the current Gryffindors greeted her warmly when they saw her, and even more so when she awarded the members of the DA a ridiculous number of points for driving Umbridge out of the castle. Although that was mostly on principle. Hermione didn't have the heart to tell her that most of the students had long since been ignoring the House Cup competition. Sunday was also the day that the Daily Prophet broke the big story about Voldemort's return, after shorter announcements about the happenings on the previous 2 days. Hermione was thankful that Rita Skeeter still had another week on her 1-year ban on publishing. She hoped she didn't regret not making a better deal. Finally, that morning, Colin Creevey met Hermione at the kitchens with his camera, as they'd agreed, bringing Dennis along with him.
"All right, Hermione," he said. "What are we looking at today?" "Just something that only the Newt Ancient Rune students normally ever see," she said. She motioned for 2 house elves who were holding hands to come forward. "Colin, Dennis, this is Dobby and Sonia. They'll be getting us in."
"Pleased to meet you, Messrs. Creevey," Sonia squeaked. "Please be following us."
Dobby opened the door leading from the basement level of the grand staircase downward, and Colin and Dennis could see the double ring of glowing quartz stones 200 feet below.
"Whoa, what is this?" Colin said.
"Those are the Anchor Stones of Hogwarts," Hermione said. "All the wards and enchantments of the school, plus things like the National Portkey and Flute Networks, are carved into that stone circle. It's supposed to be the most powerful concentration of magic in Western Europe."
"Merlin's beard! This is so cool! And you want us to photograph this?"
"Just a few pieces. We don't want the full content of the wards falling into the wrong hands. I want to look for sequences that resemble the ones we found yesterday."
Colin and Dennis readily agreed. It turned out to be pretty easy to find most of the runes that were on the Ministry runestone. They were carved into the softer, scratch tiles of obsidian embedded into the floor, no doubt later additions from when the Ministry was founded, long after Hogwarts was built. She also looked around for more information about the geometric structure of the school and a few other puzzles she had, but she kept the details of that to herself. With the photos taken care of, they climbed back up, and Hermione rejoined Harry and the Weasleys for an in-depth discussion about prophecies and Horcruxes. They had waited to digest the material last night, but they knew that they couldn't get out of it any longer.